Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Carol Silver Elliott. I'm President and CEO of the Jewish Home Family. And we are, as always, happy to be joining you to talk about World Elder Abuse Awareness Day and to play a part, we hope, in educating our community, our professionals, as well as our lay community. I said this morning, and I think we all feel this way, would that we didn't have to educate our community about elder abuse, would that this was not an issue. But the reality is it is an issue. And we know that the statistics indicate that somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million older adults in this country are victims of elder abuse every year. It's a cause we at the Jewish Home feel very committed to. We have had the only elder abuse shelter in the state of New Jersey since 2015. And it is part of our mission, we believe, in caring for the most vulnerable elderly, to not just provide shelter, which I'll tell you about in a little more detail later in our program, but also to make sure that people are aware of what to look for, what to do if they suspect elder abuse, and really have an understanding of the basics of what elder abuse really means and what it's all about. We have a wonderful panel here joining us this afternoon, and we're very fortunate. I know that some of you signed up thinking we were going to have Dr. Lydia Wagner with us, and Dr. Wagner, unfortunately, is victim to COVID right now, and she's quite ill. So she let us know yesterday that she couldn't make it, but I am absolutely thrilled that Dr. Ritu Suri has joined us. Dr. Suri is not only in private practice in our community, but she's the Associate Medical Director here at the Jewish Home. And thank you for parachuting in. We so appreciate you all the time, but in this circumstance as well. So Dr. Suri is going to lead off talking a little bit about the medical aspects, the things that she might see as a physician, both in the community setting as well as in a residential setting. And then we will hear from Morey Greenberg. Stephen is an attorney in private practice. He does a lot of work in elder care. He is a member of the Jewish Home Family Board and has been for many years. And I will also say that as we have handled some very complicated issues with elder abuse victims here, Steve has always been there to jump in and help us and come up with ways to help us help victims. And last but not least, we have Sonia Aufiero, and Sonia is the Supervisor of Adult Protective Services for Bergen County. APS are the first line of defense for many of our abused elders. They're also wonderful partners for us as we work in the shelter. And we are thrilled to have all of you here. So Dr. Suri, I'm going to ask you to start out, please. Oh, and I should say, please, if you have questions, put them either in the Q&A or in preferably the Q&A or in the chat. We will get to all of your questions.
Great. So as Carol said, 1 in 10 elder is actually abused during their lifetime above the age of 60. It is, it can be in the form of physical, financial, just plain neglect, emotional abuse. So emotional abuse is probably the most common, but financial abuse is probably the most reported because you kind of find out either from the bank or you find out from the family members or somebody else. But nonetheless, all of these constitute abuse, and all of you are aware sexual abuse also occurs. And we know that, I really take pride in being the Associate Medical Director and learning about the shelter here, but also the fact that, it is a long-term care facility, and we all know that long-term care is considered a risk factor for abuse. And I hope and believe that, Jewish Home is not where you expect that. So why is it underreported? I think it is the fear on the behalf of the sufferer. It's also the shame that they feel that they will experience if they report it. It's also because the perpetrator is probably isolating the person who's being abused. And it's also, they sometimes don't understand, is this really abuse? So I'll give you an example of something that when I started in private practice myself in 2007, it happened to me. There was two older ladies, sisters, living 2 streets down from me in Tenafly, New Jersey. And I didn't think it would happen in the 21st century, but it was shocking. So a care manager called me and she said that, can you make home visits for them? And at that time, it was like basically working as a hospitalist in my private practice. And it was like, it's tough, and I kept postponing it. And she's like, she would literally beg me. And she says, can you please come and see these sisters? I said, okay. Went in, the house was spick and span. The aide was very knowledgeable. She knew everything about their medications. Perfect. I mean, you could not expect anything better. And here I am, like, when I examined them, their mini mentals and their cognition is so poor. And I'm like, how are these two managing? How are they financially managing themselves? So I'm talking to the older sister is really, got advanced dementia. The younger sister, who's 93, by the way, tells me, oh, you know what, how I manage, I go to the bank, I walk with the landscaper to the bank, I withdraw the money, I give it to him, and I have my credit card is with the aide, and she does all the shopping. And I'm like, here, really, that is interesting. So obviously she was not recognizing that this was abuse, right? And the care manager finally found a niece who lived in Boston. We were able to go to the bank manager and looked at the credit card bills. Believe it or not, all the shopping was for the kids of the babysitter, the aide in the home. And the home was relatively small, and I live in Tenafly, so I knew exactly. And it's, and the guy was taking $800 a week for landscaping from them, cash. So, this is a prime example of why and what happens. This is very common, much more common than we think it is. Psychological abuse is extremely common because as we all talk about the stress in the last 2 years, stress is high in general, but in the last 2 years, it has gone up exponentially. The living arrangements of our patients and their children has changed dramatically as well. A lot of their children have lost their jobs. They've moved in back with the parents. Now they're kind of financially dependent on their parents. They're physically also living with the parents, and they now have to take, the burden of taking care of their parents, and at the same time looking for a job, or maybe not a job, and can't find one. So that has caused a lot of frustration in the children. There is a lot of emotional abuse that is going around right now. The caregiver burden is extremely high. And you know what, a lot of this workforce that is, I call them the workforce because they're the unpaid workforce, but they are undertrained. Obviously, they don't know how to take care of their elders. And, undertraining is really a high risk factor for a lot of the abuse that we see. And, what do we look for? Like, let's say if we have a patient who comes in, the biggest point is right now, everybody wants to do a Zoom call and nobody wants to come into the office, for the fear of COVID. But, as a geriatrician myself, we have made an effort that if they're really not coming into the office, we will go and make a home visit because we do want to see our patients. But even over the Zoom, we try to have bigger screens and we try to look around while our elder is moving around, or, we try to get the family in the screen or out of the screen to see what's going on around. But, if you have unexplained bruises, and not unexplained bruises, but bruises that are in unlikely places, right? When you're walking, where are you going to hit? You're going to hit at the front of your leg or on your toes. But if you have bruises behind your thighs, on your back, if they have bruises, those are really markers of that something is happening here. underweight, are they eating? Are they being fed? Is there, groceries in the house? So all of them can borderline between neglect and abuse, developing pressure sores at home, not having proper hygiene, underdressed, unkempt. So all of those are, signs that you look for amongst the elderly. So the other thing that I wanted to point out is, obviously age over 80 is a very high risk factor. People of color is a very high risk factor. Long-term care facility is a high risk factor. Women are at high risk, though they say that men face much more violent kind of abuse. So, we do have to be mindful. Now, the reason we all look for this is obviously their quality of life goes down if they are being abused in any way, shape, or form, but it also increases their risk of mortality by 300%. So, we really need to be very, very mindful of something like that. And that's all I have, but I think we have a lot of esteemed panelists here, so I'm looking to hear from them now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. And we will have, again, please put your questions in the Q&A and we can have some time for questions at the end. And that was really helpful to set the foundation for us. We also know that, you talked a little bit about financial abuse and control and isolation. And I know Steve has a lot to say on that subject. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And good afternoon. And thanks to everybody for being here. It's the most important topic. I think a lot of, many of the cases like this that come across my desk, excuse me, are some of the most important cases I have, and some of them are most difficult cases to resolve. And of course, the reason for that is that the people that are the targets here, if we can call them that, don't have the resources, the wherewithal, to help themselves. So they're looking for, they don't know that they're looking for us, but they're looking for us to help them. And I think before we get into the meat of this, I'd like to just briefly tell you a little bit about myself, so you get an idea where I'm coming from on this. As Carol mentioned, I have been a board member, excuse me, I don't know, it's my throat here is a little whatever, board member for a long time, a Jewish Home Family, and I've been involved in things there, as Carol said, with regard to allegations, that elders, when they were home or whatever, were being abused, or even while they're in the home, there's financial abuse going on from their relatives' home to them. Okay, so I do a lot of cases that in my practice that involve abuse, that involve guardianships, which also often result from abuse. I've been served as guardian often, and also a lot of what's called undue influence cases, because those usually have a very high element of abuse that results in this allegation, in fact, of undue influence. In my law practice also, which is actually most of my practice, I'm basically a business attorney. I do a lot of corporate things, corporate litigation, and so forth. And I know the billing is that I'm an elder law attorney, and that's true to the extent of what we're talking about here and the things I mentioned. But a word of caution, without disrespect to any other attorneys, a lot of types of practices are called elder law practices. And if you have a situation where you think you need an attorney involved, you need to try and make sure that the attorney has the expertise in these kind of cases, not just that they're doing Medicare, Medicaid kind of transfers, which is nothing wrong with, I respect that, and not just that they're doing wills and powers of attorney, but they're experienced in this kind of case, because to think you can just always sit down and talk to people and it resolves, unfortunately, that's not what happened. That's not what happens. I certainly have cases where that happens, but unfortunately, when I get involved, it often involves some pretty intense litigation ultimately to get these things resolved. So again, you need to try and make sure that somebody who you're getting involved with has that kind of expertise. So to get into the meat of this, I'd like to present a vignette of a case. Of course, we're not going to identify the people. And actually, I've scrambled it up a little and moved in a few things that are from other cases, so nobody would be able to identify it, but they're all things that happened, and most of them happened in one or two particular cases, and I think it's instructive and shows you what's not necessarily the norm, but exists and is horrible when it exists, and how many different ways there can be abuse going on at the same time. So 4 adult siblings, all of whom were very accomplished and very busy, came to see me, and it was about their mom, who was elderly, and about a 5th sibling who was not, her life was sort of differently focused. It wasn't so much on career and so forth. And mom, they decided correctly, needed supervision, needed care. And for whatever reason, they decided that the 5th sibling, who I'm going to call the caregiver in quotes, and you'll understand why in quotes as we go along in this, okay, she was going to be the one to be the day-to-day involved with what's going on with mom, who moved up here from Virginia and was where she had lived, raised her children with her husband, who is now deceased. And so she's living now in some sort of little apartment that the caregiver puts her in, and totally not in keeping with her lifestyle and her ability to have an appropriate, a nice place to live in. And there's a lot of things being presented to me that are going on. There's a very limited, extremely limited access being allowed to what the people that are going to be my clients, the 4 siblings and the grandchildren. There's pretty much no contact allowed with anyone else from the outside world. There's a lot of issues with medical care. There's a lot of problems. She had many interests that she pursued even as she got older, and she's been cut off from all those things. And she has a different caregiver, the 24/7 on-site caregiver, who also has to be in quotes. And this is, you find this very often. She was a lady who English was not her first language. She didn't speak very much English or very well at all. She cooked very nicely. She smiled, and she was respectful. She was, trying to be nice to the person, but she had no clue about, socialization, activities, what to be on guard for, what the needs really were. Okay, so that's what we have. And we also have a circumstance where the mom was at the point where she figured this out, and she didn't want to be there anymore. And she didn't want to be with this caregiver. She wanted to be back in Virginia, where she had a life and friends and everything else. But she wasn't willing to say that to anyone except her other 4 children. If anyone, the doctor did get involved, or whoever, or somebody did visit, there's no way she was going to, matter of family dynamics and not making waves, according to her, which when I later spoke to her, is really what the reason was. She wasn't going to say anything. Okay, so we, and by the time they retained me, which was 3 or 4 weeks after they first came to see me, now there's already an action pending in Superior Court to have her declared completely mentally incapacitated on every issue involving her life. Medical, because basis is she doesn't agree with her daughter caregiver, and therefore she must be mentally incapacitated, and she doesn't understand what her living arrangements should be, again, because she disagrees with the daughter who's wanting to become her guardian, and financial, because she supposedly doesn't understand her checkbook or her savings account books or anything else like this. So she's supposedly mentally incapacitated and has 2 affidavits from doctors, and no disrespect to our doctor here or anybody else, but they had no experience in this kind of stuff. They didn't do abuse cases, they didn't do incapacity cases, and how they signed these affidavits, we'll get to that in a moment. So we started to investigate. We set up a team, which in these cases that I'm describing, you need a team. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's in court already. We had a great forensic psychiatrist, a social worker, a care manager. Access was limited. Through the court, we got some access, but so we're working on this. We found out even more horrible stuff. Okay, this person had medical orders in effect that not only were do not resuscitate, not only were do not transport to the hospital, but was do not treat. And there was really not a lot wrong with her physically. She had some maladies, but nothing big deal. And the idea later from questioning the daughter was, if she got an ingrown toenail that became infected and spread through her body, that was fine with the daughter, that she was going to die from that. She was a do not treat. It was, I don't know, like I say, I don't know how she got those orders in effect, they wouldn't be in effect at the Jewish home. Somebody would have quickly picked that up, but that's not appropriate. But there we were. Okay, so that became a really, intense litigation. Didn't last that long, luckily. And on a Friday afternoon, in the summer, I remember we finally got an oral order from the judge that she could leave. And she did go back to Virginia. The next morning, her son had a friend with a private plane. So she went back to Virginia and she proceeded to have a nice life for another, I think it was 4 or 5 years, doing all her things and going to the movies when the Metropolitan Opera was showing an opera, because she loved opera and everything else. So it turned out to be a good story, but it was a horror show. And if she didn't have concerned children with the resources to do this, because none of it was cheap, and I don't know where she would be. It was the destruction of someone's life. It was a total removal of everything that was part of their life for no reason that was any kind of reason. So I think, this case shows, I think, how complex it can be, how out of the ordinary it can be, how so many things you couldn't even imagine that could happen by a person who somebody on the outside would say it's a well-meaning person. It's a daughter who's ostensibly taking care of her, but she's spending time, but she's not taking care of her. And it also illustrates another thing, which I would like to add. I appreciate very much Dr. Suri setting forth the different kinds of abuse, so I won't have to do that. But there's one more that I really like to emphasize, and I think it's maybe implicit in some of the other ones, but I think it should be explicit. It's never on the list that I see on the internet or any place, but it's real. And that's the level of care. What care should this person be getting? They shouldn't be getting less than they need, but more can be a problem also. So this lady had all this supposed care with all these doctor's orders and all this supposed attention and a 24/7 caregiver. That wasn't what she needed. She needed all these restrictions and all this stuff. And on the other side, in the same case, okay, she was going to die from an infection from an ingrown toenail from no care. Pretty unusual. Usually you have one or the other, and that's bad enough. But here we had two. Okay, so I think also it illustrates everything is an individual. There's nothing that's that's standard. You have to really look at this, and people say, well, how do you spot this? And again, a little word of caution. And it's never the victim's fault as far as I'm concerned, but you are dealing with an older person, and there could be dementia issues. There weren't in this case. There could be, she could be sleep deprived because of her situation. She could have some physical malady like Parkinson's that could be distorting her perception of what's going on. You don't want to be in a position where you're taking something either way on face value and in essence displacing an actual good relative who's a good caregiver, who's trying to do and is doing the right thing. And you have a person who can't perceive it that way and is, alleging abuse, whether consciously or not. So you have to be very careful with that. Also, Dr. Suri mentioned, the mini mental and all that, which is great. Sometimes you have to disguise that into a conversation that's not really a conversation. It seems like a test because there's limitations to how much someone's going to do that with you. But the best thing to spot these things is have as much involvement as you can with as many professionals or certifiably good family members that are going to have accurate reporting. And I think that kind of stuff is the main way to prevent this. Of course, in addition to education, which we're all trying to do here, and is difficult because it's difficult to get a big enough audience. So it's still like a retail operation, as I say, instead of a wholesale operation. So you got to get more op-eds in the New York Times and all this kind of stuff and other papers to get more education. If I have another few seconds here, it's another short vignette. It's not anywhere near as long as the other one. If Carol wants to shut my microphone, she could do that, but it'll only be a minute or two. Okay, and this is this case, again, an older lady. Unfortunately, in that age bracket, stereotypically, it's mostly, but not exclusively, older ladies. And she was moving into dementia. She wasn't all the way into it, but she was certainly a good way into this. She's living at her home. She's got two daughters, one of whom became my client. The other one, being the dominant personality at the time, she was again adamant, like she was on a mission, like the other caregiver was in the other case, that mom's got to stay home forever. Okay, and the problem with mom staying home forever was in one sense, it was like the other case. She was totally isolated. There was no one coming to see her. She had the same type of stereotype of hired caregiver that I said. And she was interesting because she was a very social person. I knew her for about 40 years, and she was a full-time volunteer in a nursing home. And everybody loved her there, and the staff loved her. She knew everybody, and she knew residents, and she knew the doctors, and she knew everyone. And we fought very hard, and finally the court-appointed person gave in and said, okay, I understand why that might be better for her. And she went to live in a nursing home, and it was just wonderful. Everybody treated her like a queen, and she had all her socialization opportunities and all her friendship, and think she was volunteering in a certain sense again in that way. So again, can't listen to the media. Everybody's not the same. You have to really look at the thing, and you have to really be sensitive to what is abuse. And sometimes, I say it's the smell test. You don't exactly know what it is, and it may be something different than you initially think. But if it doesn't feel right or smell right, there's something going on that you need to find out about. And maybe it's just that the person is not reporting properly, and that's great if that's all it is. But maybe more likely there's something really going on. So thanks for letting me exceed my time limit, and thank you also to everybody else who's presenting. I'm anxious. Great hearing Dr. Suri. I'm anxious to hear the lady from Adult Protective Services, Sonia.
Thank you. I just want to comment, I think it's a very critical point that if something doesn't smell right, if it doesn't feel right, something could be wrong. We had a shelter case, or an attempted shelter case, with the help of APS, not here when I was in Ohio, and a hairdresser called us. A hairdresser called us and said, there's a woman, she comes to me every Friday, and this week when she came, every time I washed her hair, moved her hair, whatever, she was going, oh, and just grunting a little bit. And the hairdresser said, what's going on with you? You've never done this before. What's hurting you? So she pressured her a little bit in a sweet way, and found out that the woman had moved with her brother. Her husband had passed away, and the brother had jumped down a flight of stairs, and he was really confining her to the basement of the house. And the APS, we called APS. They went to the house. Indeed, the woman was being, sort of treated like Cinderella and kept in the basement doing the ironing, and she was physically abused, and she wouldn't leave the house, and she wouldn't leave this abuser. And, that's one of the big issues we face in elder abuse. If you look at the statistics for how many people, if they call domestic violence hotline, most of those people come into a domestic violence shelter. But if they reach out for elder abuse services, very few of them follow through and get what they need. So Sonia, I am so happy that you're here with us today. Adult Protective Services is really the first line of defense in this work, and we are so happy to have such a great working relationship with you. But please talk to us about the work that you do and the things that you see in your work.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I would like to start by saying that just like Dr. Suri was saying, a lot of times elderly are afraid to call and report abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. And that's why it's important that we keep our eyes open, our ears open, and we can call and make referrals on behalf of all these elderly, just like the hairdresser did. And to be honest with you, a hairdresser actually has the obligation to call and report. She's she's mandated to call and report any abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation because she holds a license. So that's actually very interesting, and I'm glad that she did. But we are the voice for the elderly. We should be, and that's why it's important to check on them. What we do in Adult Protective Services is we investigate cases of neglect, abuse, and financial exploitation. We receive referrals by phone call. We act within 72 hours. So anyone who calls a referral should know that we will go out regardless of whether we think that a case may be a case or not. We still have to go and investigate. So, but we are not able to call the person who referred the case and give them an update. So that's why when we receive a referral, we always make sure to let people know that just know we will go out within 72 hours, but we will not be able to report back to you. Confidentiality is very important in our job, and we take it serious because we can get in a lot of trouble, and we do it for the safety of the client. What we do in regards to our initial home visit is to assess the situation, to assess the home, to assess mental capacity. I saw the one question that was there, and I can answer it right now because it's appropriate to answer it right now. We only get involved and we open cases when a person has diminished cognitive, person has to be declining cognitively, have advanced dementia, or have some medically conditions. So they have to be medically compromised. And when they are medically compromised, they have to be unable to care for themselves or their finances or make decisions. So if someone has capacity, unfortunately, we cannot open a case. That we have to respect the person's rights. When we open a case, we take that right away from the client. So if someone has capacity and is independent, it's not fair for us to impose. And I understand people sometimes make decisions that we question whether they're right or not. And sometimes we get upset that these clients are really not making the right decisions. For example, and the question is, what if the person doesn't want to report that they're being abused by a family member or by a friend or whoever it may be? Well, guess what? They have the right to not report it, unfortunately. Just like a wife doesn't leave a husband who's being abusive, right? Can make her leave the house. And if they have capacity, they have the right to still make their own decisions. So the cases that we do open are the ones where a person is lacking capacity. That's why a cognitive assessment is so important. That's why sometimes we get doctors involved, because sometimes people do present well, and it doesn't mean that they have capacity. We have to actually assess everything, the conditions of where they're living, the people that they're living with, and also their finances. It could be that they're presenting well, they're taking care of themselves, their hygiene and everything, but yet bills are not being paid. So then you know that there is something wrong. Sometimes we do the assessment and they can answer every single question. But then if their bills are not being paid and they have no idea how much they have in the bank, then you know that there is something wrong. So Adult Protective Services, once they open a case, we will continue working with this individual to either set up services within the same month that we open the case. We try to do it as soon as we can. That's why it's important that we have a good relationship with other agencies. And then we also set up POA if the person doesn't have any relatives. Try to work with an attorney, and ultimately we also file for guardianship. So these are just some of the things that Adult Protective Services does. We have so many cases. We see it all. When we think we have seen it all, something new comes up, and it's always surprising to see how our elderly can be so neglected. When I was a social worker in the field a few years ago before the pandemic, I was able to place a lady in a Jewish home in the Safe Haven. And that was an amazing positive experience. We haven't had to place someone else since then, but I'm sure we're going to come across another case. Abuse out there, it's hidden by so many clients, and the abusers sometimes present well. When we go and do an assessment or an investigation in the homes, we always make sure that we meet with the person in private. If the abuser is there in the home, just know that we will separate them, and we will always have an interview with the client by ourselves. Sometimes it has been necessary to call the police, and they are amazing. They love to escort APS into the homes, and we have a good relationship with every police department in every single town of Bergen County. And that's why when we are in the field, we feel safe. We actually do feel safe. We know we can count on them. And so we are able to do our interview without any obstacles at all from the abuser. At this point, I don't know if you would like me to say anything else, or we can just answer questions.
So I'd like to talk just a little bit about shelter so that everyone has a sense of what shelter is all about. The elder abuse shelter movement in this country is really about 17 or 18 years old. Our friends at the Hebrew Home in Riverdale were really the first folks to establish this kind of an elder abuse shelter. And it actually came out of a discussion that Dan Reingold, who's my counterpart there, had with a woman named Joy Solomon, who's an attorney who was working in the area of domestic violence. And Joy said, we have elderly women who are victims of abuse, and it doesn't fit for them to be in a DV shelter. There are bathrooms down the hall, and there are stairs, and there are little children and toys on the floor, and it's not a good scenario. And Dan said, I don't know why we couldn't shelter older people within the walls of our nursing home. And that's how the shelter movement that exists today was born. There are just over 20 shelters in the country today. I wish that there were more. I also wish that victims were more willing to come to shelter. So what does shelter do? Shelter in our model, and there are some different models, in our model means that if an older adult is in an emergent or urgent situation and they need a safe place, we provide a stay of 90 to 120 days. We do that at no charge. And we provide a variety of services that have been also provided pro bono. Our physicians, our pharmacy, transport services have all stepped up and been of great help with our shelter. Our goal from the minute that somebody comes to shelter is to start planning their discharge to the safest and least restrictive alternative. This is not about keeping people at the Jewish home. This is about helping them to find their life. So what do we see in shelter? What kinds of cases have we seen? And we have a number of stories we could tell you. I'll just tell you a couple of quick ones. One that we worked on with APS not that long ago. Sonia will likely remember this one. There was a woman living in an apartment, and the APS had received a referral on her. And they were very concerned, the caseworker went out, they opened a case, they were very concerned that this woman was sort of being held hostage, if you will, prisoner by her landlord. And they discussed it with the woman and offered her the opportunity to come to shelter and discussed it with us. We said, bring her to shelter. And then when they came to transport her, the landlord had dogs and threatened weapons. And the woman said, oh, okay, I'm okay. And probably 18 months later, the case had moved to a different caseworker from APS who said, you know, I'm going to go check on this woman. And the person went in, and sure enough, the woman was not in a good situation. The landlord had the power of attorney financially and medically, and in a sort of a horrifying way, come to find out he had cameras in every single room of her apartment, including the bathroom. What had triggered this second APS visit, I should say, is that she was on a list for subsidized housing. And that's, you know, in Bergen County, that's a multi-year process. So she got a call that she was going to be, her number was going to come up, that she was going to be eligible for subsidized housing. Landlord is listening to everything. He hears this and he said to her, take your name off the list. That's what triggered APS to come back out again. And we got a call from the caseworker sitting in the parked car in front of the house saying, I think we got to get her out of here now. We said, bring her. The police, God bless them, came, and the APS folks worked with them, and this woman came to shelter. Lo and behold, she had a niece who lived more towards central Jersey, and she, after staying with us a few weeks, was able to go and live with her niece. You know, these are not unusual circumstances. These are circumstances that we see. We had another woman here. She had moved up from Florida, and she had moved in with her daughter, and the daughter was not only financially exploiting her, but physically abusing her. And she said to the daughter, I'm not feeling well, I want to go to the doctor. And the daughter said, you're not going to the doctor because the doctor didn't want, or she didn't want, I should say, the doctor to see bruises on her mother. And so the daughter left the house, and this 80-something-year-old woman who was about as big as a twig started walking down the street, taking herself to the hospital. It was a very hot summer day, and a neighbor a block away saw this and said, what's going on? And the woman explained she had to go to the hospital. She wasn't feeling well, and her daughter wouldn't let her. So the woman wisely brought out a lawn chair, gave her a glass of water, and called the police. This poor woman, not only was she being terribly abused, but she was terrified of this daughter and the boyfriend, to the extent that she wouldn't allow anybody to go back to the home and even secure any of her belongings. So she had no identity. Stephen will remember this case. She had no identity whatsoever. She had her name, but she had no driver's license. She had no Medicare card. She had no nothing. And it took us months and a lot of great advice, and eventually the intervention of Josh Gottheimer's office to finally be able to, you know, you can steal somebody's identity in 2 seconds, I guess, if you know what you're doing. But it took us months to rebuild this woman's identity. She ended up in supportive housing in Bergen County. You know, I can go on and on about cases that we have seen and people who are in terrible circumstances. The worst of it is, however, and Dr. Suri led off with this, many of these elderly victims do not want to get help. You know, you think about it, many of them are women, many of them are over the age of 85. And the abuser, oftentimes, when it's community abuses, which is what we generally deal with, it's their child or grandchild. And, you know, you put yourself in that position and you say, gee, I taught this child their values, you know, this is all I have, this is my family. How do I separate from that? The other big thing that's an impediment is they don't want to leave, I call it their stuff. This is my home. I've lived here for 60 years. I can't just move out and leave everything. But yet they're putting their lives at risk. And I am quite certain that many of their lives are foreshortened by the fact that they are not getting help. We cannot force anybody to get help, to work with APS, to work with us. I've said this many times to our team, we are not in the kidnapping business. We hear terrible stories. We would like to come and save you, but that's not our job. It's not our job to pluck you out of the home, and it's not our job to fix the abuser. People have to be willing to get help. They have to be willing to work with us. They have to be willing to work with APS and whoever else is involved. We welcome the opportunity to share information in any setting. I know APS does as well. If you belong to a group or an organization, we'd love to come and talk to you. We did do a lot of pre-COVID speaking to discharge planners and medical staff, and Stephen and I have spoken to attorneys on multiple occasions. It's really important that we all be tuned into that, because just like that woman who's a hairdresser that I referenced at the beginning, we have to be the eyes and ears. We have to be the eyes and ears. If you go to religious services and there's an elderly person that normally sits next to you and all of a sudden they don't come anymore, ask a question. If your neighbor who's always been perfect, all of a sudden is wearing the same clothes every day, ask a question. You know, people's circumstances change and we really need to help them if we can. I think that's our obligation. Kathy Greenlee, who was the Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services, is a passionate advocate for elder abuse prevention and elder abuse shelters. And she said once words that always resonate with me, and that is, she said, you know, the system of shelters that we have for victims of domestic violence, which is a great system in this country, was founded by people who survived domestic violence. She said, our victims of elder abuse are not going to survive this abuse. And if they do, they won't have the wherewithal to create the support that they need. So we are really obligated to do that. We do have some questions, so I'm gonna read them and throw them out to our group here. The first question was, is there any way to protect someone who's not willing to admit that their relative is abusing them? And Sonia answered that question. Another question, Sonia, for you. Can someone report anonymously to APS?
It is always anonymous. Even if we have your name and phone number, we will never disclose that information to the client or their relatives. But we need to have it just in case we need to follow up with a question or so. But we always make sure that when someone calls, we let them know that we will never disclose their information.
Thank you. Here's a question. Do you offer social worker to help the family if they do not want to open a case?
If they do not want to open a case, we give them alternative solutions. We refer them to different agencies and even legal services.
Thank you. There's a question about the literature, which Dr. Suri answered in the chat. Where can we find the elder abuse shelter location list? All of the elder abuse shelters are part of what's called the Spring Alliance, Shelter Partners Regional, National, Global. They have a website. Ezra, if you could put the website for Spring Alliance in the chat, that would be helpful. And it lists all of the shelter partners that are currently in existence. You can also look at the Hebrew Home. It's now called River Spring Health, the Weinberg Center. They have a white paper on elder abuse prevention and the shelter movement that I believe is accessible to anybody. So that's another place you can look for information. I think Ezra's going to put the Spring Alliance website in there for us, maybe. There it is. So if you want it, it's right in the chat. And I don't see any additional questions, but we're happy to take any. We'll just wait a second to see if anyone has any more questions. APS direct line. Thank you, Sonia. Where is the literature? You can actually search it online, but I know that Dr. Suri had indicated where, Dr. Suri.
PubMed has published a lot of studies. So, so if you click on PubMed, you know, there are a lot of studies that are done on this, and, you know, a lot of statistics is coming from there, and a lot of the literature about the people at high risk and what kind of abuse is more common and what kind of, you know, the different groups.
I would like to say, Carol, just back to the social worker, almost always I recommend that a social worker and or care manager be involved, even if it's not going to continue with the attorney or the MD or whomever, because they often have the ability, you know, to establish a relationship over time and find out things that, you know, we can't find out so easily otherwise.
Thank you. We got one more question. I'll throw it out to the group. if you could add a law or legislation that would help prevent elder abuse, what would it be?
In my case, it would be to prosecute, bring those who are also scammers, even to those who have capacity.
Good one. How about you, Stephen?
I would get more funding, have them legislate funding for all these things, services and shelters and everything that we need.
Dr. Suri, anything?
I think what I would like is, the legislative assembly to have more power over some of the things that we try to do, or certain interventions that we try to make, and there are roadblocks. I think that that is my frustration. So I think I would love to have something about, to do with the roadblocks and like, let's move the things along. And yes, we do have to follow a system, but it is sometimes you're just cringing inside, and you know that the elderly is at really high risk, and you were left like, okay, you can't do anything. So sometimes this confidentiality really takes over, and you're not able to do anything. So that is my take on, the same way the pendulum is turning now, that there is exchange of information between hospital systems, so we can provide better care. We really need to be able to communicate these social determinants of health. I think it is really important that we look at it holistically and really pay attention to, some of these things that really impact our elders, I mean, you talk all the time about controlling chronic serious illness or their medical conditions, but when you have these things impacting, how are you supposed to control their illnesses? And it really impacts them going back and forth to the emergency room. And we all know that this causes them to be in the emergency room much more than, their blood sugar or their blood pressure, or, this is one of the most important reasons that they land up there. And sometimes you feel like, maybe giving a little more authority to, the people who are making and helping. So that's my vision.
Yes, I would say that I'm going to sort of piggyback on what Sonia said. I'd like to see more mandated education. I'd like to see more mandated prosecutions. I think, unfortunately, we sometimes see, even with law enforcement, and they're wonderful, and sometimes with medical people as well, they're old, they don't really know, and they minimize, or we're not going to prosecute because chances are they're not going to still be alive when this all comes to fruition. We had a case here of a woman who was so terrified. She happened to be a participant in our day program, and she was afraid to go home. She told us she thought her daughter was going to kill her. She was so afraid that we took her to a room, and she wouldn't walk down a hallway that had windows. And when the police officer whom we asked to come and take her statement came, he really didn't want to talk to her. He said, look, my grandfather, he had dementia, and he said people hit him, and nobody ever hit him. And we said, please, just meet this woman. She was 100% cognitively intact. She was in a terrible situation. And he came out from an hour with her and said, oh my gosh, you're right. You're right. She knew what happened to her. But unless people in key positions are really educated, and unless we put some teeth into the laws to protect elders, it worries me that we're not going to make the kind of progress we need to make. So,
yep.
You are all amazing and wonderful, and thank you. And thank you all in our audience for being with us today. It is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, as we said at the outset. Let us all hope for a day when we don't have to commemorate this day anymore. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.